Computer glitches and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. We don't have a millennial today because we have Rick Manning, who has joined us again, and we're really honored to have him. He's with Americans for Limited Government, and also they produce the dailytorch.com, right?
Correct.
And of course, we have Christopher Hopkins, our assistant producer, and Adam Couture, our producer. So this podcast is called Computer Glitches. You've probably heard about the computer glitches happening in certain places. Apparently, they're expanding. What a surprise. So we're going to talk about, with Rick Manning, all of the weird stuff that's happening in this particular election and where there are questions and what has actually happened and has it been a free and fair election? And we're going to really explore also what AOC is talking about the election, that she didn't actually run on socialism. But first up, Sidney Powell suggests there is election fraud, but she's more specific about that election fraud and how it has gone about with the computer glitches. So she was on with Maria Bartiromo, where Maria Bartiromo was discussing, well, what about that computer glitch that happened in, I think, the state of Michigan? Well, Sidney Powell discusses that, and we have a series of clips, just 2 clips, and here's the first.
That's to put it mildly. The computer glitches could not and should not have happened at all. That is where the fraud took place, where they were flipping votes in the computer system or adding votes that did not exist. We need an audit of all of the computer systems that played any role in this fraud whatsoever. And, you know, Joe Biden had it right. He said that he had the biggest voter fraud organization ever, and he didn't need people's votes now. He would need people later. They had this all planned, Maria. They had the algorithms. They had the paper ballots waiting to be inserted if and when needed. And notably, President Trump's vote in the blue states went up enormously. That's when they had to stop the vote count and go in and replace votes for Biden and take away Trump votes.
And so that was Sidney Powell on Maria Bartiromo, giving great detail about the computer glitches. But now we have a second clip, and we're going to play that before Rick and I talk about and respond to Maria Bartiromo and Sidney Powell. The second clip is also Sidney Powell saying, well, guess who is part of Dominion Software, the company that produces and provides and maintains, presumably, the software in these particular counties where there are glitches. We have that clip, and here it is.
I also see reports that Nancy Pelosi's longtime chief of staff is a key executive at that company. Richard Blum, Senator Feinstein's husband, significant shareholder of the company. What can you tell us about the interest on the other side of this Dominion software?
Well, obviously, they have invested in it for their own reasons and are using it to commit this fraud to steal votes. I think they've even stolen them from other Democrats in their own party who should be outraged about this also. Bernie Sanders might very well have been the Democratic candidate, but they've stolen against whoever they wanted to steal it.
So isn't it interesting that maybe this software program was used and put into place not just to, of course, defeat Donald Trump, potentially, right? But also potentially to defeat Bernie Sanders in the primary. Maybe. I don't know, okay? But we're going to talk to Rick Manning because he's here with us. What do you know? Where are we today?
Well, we're trying to figure out what the truth is. And, you know, obviously there was a problem in Antrim County, Michigan, where 4,000 votes were flipped from President Trump to Joe Biden. It was only discovered because a Republican there looked at the vote count and said it is impossible for Joe Biden to win 2-1 in this county. And the county clerk said, you know, something must have gone wrong. And they recounted the ballots, the hand ballots that got placed into the machine. And they discovered that, in fact, the results were opposite of what had been reported. And they even could pinpoint what happened. The Trump votes in one category were zeroed, and the Biden votes were doubled. And so there was a real problem. And you know, Mark, one of the things they use this word glitch. Okay, glitch is such a benign word. Computer systems like this, especially one that's a simple counting system. You know, we've all used Excel. We all know if we get the formula wrong in Excel, it tells you messed up the formula.
Yes.
Well, in this instance, a glitch is you have a formula messed up. A systemic software problem is the formula doesn't count the votes properly. And when 47 counties in Michigan alone have this software, and if you do the math in terms of the same percentage of vote changes that occurred in this one small county, if that had occurred in those same percentages occurred in those 47 counties, it completely makes up the difference of the margin of victory of Joe Biden in Michigan.
Wow. So, but to be fair, we don't know that it has happened in the other 46 counties.
Correct.
We just know that it has happened in, is it Antrim County?
In Antrim County, yes,
In Antrim County. So, however, just last night, there was a breaking exclusive that there's a system glitch, and to be fair, this has not been reported in the mainstream media, but there is a site that says there's a glitch also with the same software system in Wisconsin. So in a southern county in Wisconsin, an all-red county, apparently there are 19,500 votes that were flipped in the software system, and they were flipped from Trump to Biden, and they were just discovered.
Yeah, think about it. If you have flipped 19,000 votes, if you take 19,000 votes away from the president, you give them to Biden, that's a 38,000 vote swing, 37,500 vote swing. Okay, that's a lot of votes. In fact, that's margin of victory number of votes in Wisconsin. One of the things, what we know is there's evidence that there have been system failures, and it is incumbent upon every single county that used that system to go in and hand count their ballots. The public has a right to expect, the voters in those districts have a right to expect that their ballots will not only be counted, but that they'll be counted accurately. Okay, everybody says every vote should be counted. Well, that's great, but let's make sure they're actually counted accurately also. And I guess we have to now define our terms. That was always assumed, but apparently it's no longer assumed that they're going to be counted accurately. And where this, we talk about why does this matter? Why is there a big fight? Why can't Trump just concede, be a man, walk away, blah, blah, blah. It's very simple. Our entire country is built around a concept that was espoused in the Declaration of Independence. Second paragraph starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. But it goes down a little bit and says, to protect these liberties, men form governments. And they form governments to protect the liberties with the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed is our vote. That's how we give consent. And if the vote is illegitimate, the government is illegitimate. That's the DNA of our country. And that's why the process of finding out what really happened, and if Donald Trump lost this election or can't prove that it was stolen, then Joe Biden's president.
Absolutely,
okay?
Yes.
But all these people who want to riot and protest and everything that, the president should concede, they are doing a tremendous disservice to this country, because the fact of the matter is the media does not declare the winner. The voters do. And the voters have a right to expect that their votes are going to be counted.
You mean the Fox News decision desk doesn't decide?
No, I thought we decided according to their slogan, but apparently not in terms of politics. But no, man, I just look at this, and what we're actually looking at is a system that depends upon people believing that it's accurate and fair. And if they lose, they say, okay, the other guy won. And we know that it isn't always fair. We know that the New Orleans Saints fans will continue to complain forever about the Rams, about Nickel Roby going off and engaging in non-pass interference.
Rick's from California, if you're wondering.
And Nickel Roby from USC, where I graduated. So the fact is, life isn't fair. We all know that, but the system.
But what we're seeing in D.C. now, because you basically spoke to this, which is really interesting. So we went from Joe Biden being declared the winner by the media, and there being no riots whatsoever in any cities, even though the cities were boarded up, preparing for the worst, to now, just last night in Washington, D.C., there's unrest and light rioting, if you will, in front of the White House because the millennials, for the most part, are triggered and they're involved in their cancel culture. It's like, we're going to cancel you. We don't care about the Constitution. We're going to cancel you.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is most we have to deal with is the fact that if people wanted to have winners declared based on mobs in the street, that's not America. That's a third world country. And those mobs in the street, quite honestly, the District of Columbia does a tremendous disservice by allowing them a place to stay, essentially the Black Lives Matter Plaza. The poor businesses that used to have businesses there that have been destroyed because nobody's going there for lunch. So there's a lot of things that have happened, but the biggest disservice is they've encouraged this sense that, yes, we can intimidate, we can throw a temper tantrum anytime we don't get what we want. And the reality is that we've already seen the state of Arizona, which Fox called with like 12 votes in, the state of Arizona has been pulled off of the Biden board by a number of news networks.
I did not know that.
And so, yeah, it happened yesterday. And because
it's what happens when you do a podcast is you don't have time to watch the news.
You don't have time to watch the news. But no, Arizona's now no longer on Biden's board. It's not in Trump's board, but it's too close to call.
How about Pennsylvania?
And Pennsylvania, Real Clear Politics yesterday pulled Pennsylvania from the Biden category.
So I know our podcast listeners are probably wondering, how is that possible? How do you call a huge state like Pennsylvania, and say it's for one guy, and then all of a sudden there's a pullback from a major polling firm saying, I'm not really sure this is really going for Joe Biden. How? What's happening?
Well, what's happening is they're A, counting votes, but B,
they're still counting.
Yeah, they're still counting. But B, and most importantly, there is such overwhelming evidence that those votes, many of those votes may be disqualified. And so
because they came in after Election Day.
Some of them came in after Election Day, and the Supreme Court has not ruled whether or not those votes should be counted. Okay. Situation's simple. It's really easy to understand. The law says that every vote has to be in by Election Day, in this case, November 3rd. The governor changed the law without the legislature agreeing to it. In fact, the legislature said no. So the governor changed the rules and said, no, we're going to have any vote that comes in up to November 6th. It doesn't have to arrive by November 3. It has to come in by November 6th. And by changing that, there are a significant number of votes that arrived in after November 6th. Why does that matter? It matters because there is, in fact, that is the way that people who want to cheat, what they do is they find out how many votes they need, and then they submit them. That's the oldest cheating method in the world. And until they know how many votes they need, they don't know what to do. The other piece,
and there's a history of that apparently in Philadelphia.
Well, there's a history of that across the country. Okay, let's just be real. This is not new. In 1960, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were in a very close presidential race, and in Illinois, and this is well known. This isn't like made up stuff. Okay, this is just well known. In Illinois, the rule was the downstate Republicans and the Chicago Cook County machine played chicken. And they said, we'll show you our votes if you show your votes. Well, the downstate Republicans made a mistake, and they revealed how many votes they had held back, legitimate or otherwise, okay, but how many votes they'd held back. And the minute Daley knew how many votes the Republicans had in the downstate, he knew how many votes he needed. And John F. Kennedy became president because of that.
And how's that? So how is that still happening in 2020? All these years
it's just
later?
happening. It's happening in a more sophisticated way. I mean, you have
it seems like it's happening more than ever.
Because with computers, once again, a glitch can change votes. And the dirty little secret, Mark, is that nobody would even notice this if they'd engaged in petty theft. Okay, and just like if you work at a 7-Eleven and you drink a soda every day and you don't pay for it, the 7-Eleven owner doesn't know that you're doing that, but you're effectively stealing $1.50 from the owner every single day.
No
right?
doubt, no doubt.
So it's a and whatever a soda costs at 7-Eleven. But the point is,
Well, if it's 7-Eleven, it's probably $3.
Yeah, it could be $3. But the point is, if it's done in such small quantities, nobody notices. But the Antrim County, Michigan thing was so egregious that a Republican Party activist said, wait a second, this is impossible. Joe Biden cannot have won Antrim County by a 2-to-1 margin. This is a 2-to-1 Trump county. And that forced the county clerk to say, something's wrong with this, and they did count
So what
it.
you're saying is like at the 7-Eleven where you just steal a soda, and you do that every day because you work there, it's really a rounding error, and the owner is like, there's an acceptable amount of theft because I kind of expect that, so that's just one soda. But when you take, 20 cases of soda, the owner is like, well, wait a minute.
Well, what happened to the 20 cases?
And so in Michigan, what you're saying is in Antrim County, they tried to take like 20
They
cases
tried to
of
take
soda.
20 cases of soda. And think about it, in the 47 counties, and this is the worst case scenario assuming if this was fraud, okay? The worst case scenario for them is now there has to be a hand recount of all those 47 counties. Because if a county would have voted 63% for Trump and they only voted 60% for Trump, and they would have voted 37% for Biden and they voted 40% for Biden, nobody would notice. It'd be hundreds, thousands of votes, but nobody would notice. But when you flip a whole county like that, somebody notices and suddenly you get uncovered. And so the interesting part, and this is why the process has to work, Mark. I'm not saying that Donald Trump's going to end up being president at the end of this. What I'm saying is we have to know if there was voter fraud and how many votes were impacted so we get an accurate count in the election. And for those who sit there and say, how could they make the mistake on the networks? In the year 2000, all the networks called Florida for Al Gore.
For Al Gore, yeah.
And even though it turned out to be, watching people looking at ballots and trying to figure out what the voter wanted to do based on some imaginary ability to discern, and it came down to like a couple hundred votes. So the networks all called it for Al Gore because they have systems that try to predict.
And I always thought the assumption too is the networks back then is because it was Miami-Dade, they just assumed that, that was a very blue county. Certainly at the time, they assumed what has to be for Al Gore in that county, since that's where the counting is happening.
Right.
And oh, by the way, where's the counting happening today?
Right.
In all the blue cities.
Yeah, in all the big blue
It's
cities.
still happening.
It is happening. The challenge is, and this is, if you told people Donald Trump is going to run ahead of expectations in the black community. Okay, he got nationwide 12%, but in many of these areas he was getting 15, 18% from the black community, which is a significant difference. If he ran, he's running ahead of expectations in the Hispanic community, and so he ends up running ahead in the Hispanic community, and he's not getting creamed with Republican women. So how does he lose? Every metric says how under those assumptions, nobody has Donald Trump losing. So the question is was there a legitimate number of votes cast, or was it manipulated? And Mark, the single most important thing, if people don't take anything else away from this, it's this. The Constitution has laid out a process. These genius people 240 some years ago laid out a process, and that process is that how you go about doing this. They have to have an elector for the Electoral College. Vote is on December 8. So the certification of the votes has to happen on December 8. If there's a problem and what the votes come up with are proven to be fraudulent, and the state legislature says we don't think that this is the right vote, we think there's so much fraud that we can't send electors to vote for that candidate, they can send other electors to go and vote.
And that would be the state legislature.
That would be the state legislature.
That would determine who those electors would be.
According to the Constitution.
Okay.
There's an untested law that was passed in 1880 to deal with the fact that there was a big hassle in 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes, look it up if you're interested. You can Google it, it's there. But the point is, there was a big hassle. So they changed the rule that the electors that now would have to send it to the governors to then certify. Okay, so the state legislature would then have to send it to the governor, and they would certify. Constitutionally, that's never been challenged.
Interesting.
And why that matters?
It's because of who runs Pennsylvania.
Why it matters is in Pennsylvania, the governor is a Democrat, the state legislature is Republican.
Yes.
In Michigan, the governor is a Democrat, state legislature is Republican. And you just go on and on. In Georgia, it's all Republican. So in that state, it's all Republican. In Arizona, it's all Republican. North Carolina, Republican legislature, Democrat governor. Wisconsin, Republican legislature, Democrat governor. So it may come down to a constitutional challenge as to who sends the electors.
Wow.
But remember, the genius of the Constitution is that there was a plan laid out for all of this. For instance,
It was anticipated.
For instance, if no electors are agreed upon from Pennsylvania, let's say they just say we're going to send anybody because their election's such a mess, we can't send anybody. The number that you need drops, by half of 20. Okay, so the number you need to get to suddenly goes to 260. Okay, as opposed to 270 for those who are following based on math. And so there is a map that you could do with the outstanding states right now that get a 259 to 259 outcome without Pennsylvania.
That's the Electoral College interactive map. If
Yes.
you go online, you can have all kinds of fun with it.
Yeah, you can. But the critical thing is states that are still undecided, you can go and you can create a map that says if this happens, this happens, this happens. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that we end up with a 259, 259.
In which case, what happens?
It goes to the House of Representatives, but not by a majority vote in the House of Representatives.
What?
State delegates, state delegations vote. Every state has one vote. State delegations vote. That's how it is done.
Well, explain that. I'm not following that.
Okay,
So let's
say California.
So there's a tied race in the presidency
Yes.
in the Electoral College, but meaning that neither candidate has at least 270 electoral votes.
Correct.
It then goes to the House of Representatives.
Yes.
But you're saying that the members of the House of Representatives don't get to vote, a state legislator does?
No.
Explain.
We have, like in Maryland, it's a majority Democrat state in terms of the congressional delegation.
Yes.
Maryland gets one vote.
Got it.
So Maryland would vote for?
So in Maryland, you have 8 members of the House of Representatives who represent the state of Maryland that are in the House of Representatives. 7 of those members are Democrats and 1 is a Republican. And since the delegation is overwhelmingly Democrat, obviously they're going to choose a Democrat for that one vote. Go ahead.
But you have to get to 26, a majority of the states, in order to elect a president with that. And then it gets really complicated.
So what does that work out to in the House of Representatives then, in terms of the quantity of people from the delegation? I mean, obviously, California is going to be a Democrat. Maryland's going to be a Democrat. Massachusetts, New York.
There are at least 12 districts which we don't know how they're going to come out.
Wow. You mean based on
the congressional, based on last election, there are 10 districts that Republicans are leading in.
Yes.
And there's 2 districts where Democrats are leading in Pennsylvania, which if they end up not including the late ballots, could very easily flip.
Wow.
So we don't even know who's in control of the congressional delegations right now. So it's
what a mess.
I don't want to get
what a mess.
I don't want to get people scratching their head too much.
No, it's actually I don't think they are. You've really done a great job explaining it.
But it gets a little bit weirder.
Let's hear it.
In the House, the majority controls something called the House Administration Committee. Mm-hmm. And disputed congressional elections go before the House Administration Committee. If the Republicans get really lucky and they win all the races that are still on the board,
okay,
they could be in the majority, which would mean a Republican speaker and a Republican chairman of the House Administration Committee. Unfortunately for the Republicans, because most of those disputed seats are Democrats, or Republicans, they won't be in the majority on January 3 when the House meets.
In a timely manner.
In a timely manner. And as a result,
because they won't be seated.
Because they won't be seated. And so the majority will then have their House Administration Committee will then determine the outcomes of those elections.
Oh, man.
And so that is and why that matters is, once again, if we end up with the election thrown into the House, that could be the difference of one person losing or another, and then downstream individual House members get to vote based if there's a bunch of different things happen. So so it has a direct impact on this, and it could get really messy, and a lot of people will be reading obscure sections of the Constitution to figure out what's going on. And quite honestly, I've gotten about to the level of depth that I've looked at. The bottom line on this is, anybody out there who didn't think your vote mattered, your vote mattered. But you should be, if you voted, you should be enraged that about any fraudulent voting, about anybody who is ineligible to vote who voted, about anybody who, of the dead, we always hear the apocryphal, the dead were voting, any of that occurred. Anybody who was not eligible to vote who voted.
Or manipulating ballots.
Manipulating ballots.
So let me ask you about that, because that's obviously the root of where we are today and the root of the problem that we find ourselves in. And it seems to be in primarily the Democrat states of the Rust Belt. So let's talk about that for a moment. It seems like we have two different standards for voting in America, including in the states themselves. So in Pennsylvania, there are two standards. There's the standard, I'm going to show up, I'm going to, show my voter ID, and I'm going to be there present in person, and I'm going to vote and cast my vote in person. And then there's another standard, which is I'm going to cast my ballot by mail, but you don't have to match the signature to determine if it was really me. I don't necessarily have to send a copy. In fact, I don't have to send a copy of my license with the ballot when I mail it in so that you can determine it was really me that mailed it in. I don't have to include any unique information on the ballot other than my signature for you to determine that it was really me. And I don't necessarily have to have the ballot in on election day or election night in a timely manner. There are two standards that the state of Pennsylvania has created.
Well, there are two standards, and there are actually 50 standards, because every single 51 when you count.
But what I'm referring to is two different standards within
the same state.
The states have the right to run their own elections, but here's a state, as an example, that's running its own election, but it has created two different standards and two classes of voters.
That's exactly right, and one of the great challenges that the court is going to have to decide. We know, I'll go back to 2000, Bush v. Gore, the reason the Supreme Court said they had to stop looking at ballots and trying to discern voters in Palm Beach County was because voters in Palm Beach County were being treated differently than voters in other parts of the state. Because voters in other parts of the state, if they did not have their vote processed, they were essentially set aside and weren't counted. But in Palm Beach County and Broward County, the Democrats said, we want to actually do a recount here because this is where we have the most chance to pick up votes. They didn't want to do it in rural Florida because that's where the Republicans would have picked up votes. They
didn't want to go in the panhandle.
So, because we're treating two different sets of votes differently, that's why the court said you can't do that. And let me tell you why that matters, because it actually matters in this circumstance. We haven't even talked about one of the greater voter fraud things that we have a pretty good idea happened.
What's that?
Some election officials, they took the absentee ballots, the mail-in ballots, and the ones that were improperly filled in, they fixed them. Okay? But they only fixed them if they were Democrat ballots. They disqualified them if they were Republican ballots. It's called curing. You're going to hear a word called curing ballots.
Okay.
And essentially, The rule is if you don't fill out your ballot properly, it gets set. It doesn't get counted because it wasn't filled out properly. There are ways you have to do things. You have to sign. You have to do all these things.
So you could have submitted a ballot and you may have forgotten to sign it.
Right. You didn't sign it.
Wouldn't it be interesting to know how many ballots were submitted in Pennsylvania not having been signed?
Well, I'm sure we're going to find that out. But the where the court's going to come in is when election officials fixed those mistakes for people who voted for one candidate, but didn't fix them for people who voted for another candidate. And if they fixed it in one county, but they didn't fix it in all the counties, essentially you had unequal treatment of different voters. And that's exactly why Bush v. Gore was found the way it was because voters in Broward and Palm Beach County were being treated better than voters elsewhere.
There were two standards established
in the same state. And so the curing of ballots, effectively, they're going to go through all of those places where it's alleged that they cured ballots, and they're going to be able to see where some other handwriting was used. And they're going to disqualify those ballots because of Bush v. Gore, and that will knock out a whole bunch of votes. So the challenge really is time, because you have to get all this done by December 8th when electors are chosen. And so there is a time limit. There's a race against the clock. And that is why the Supreme Court has to rule on some things pretty rapidly, because the recounts need to know what rules they're operating under. And whether it benefits the Republicans or it benefits the Democrats doesn't matter. What matters is we all have to operate under the same set of rules.
Same set of rules.
And in Pennsylvania, they did not.
Clearly. And so you would think that it's interesting how our system works and how there are corrections, and hopefully in this particular election, the corrections will be fair and accurate, as you've already said, and that the election will result in a way that people will have confidence in the outcome. And I'm restating what you said, because that's my biggest concern, because 71 million people should not be disenfranchised or even think for a moment that they were disenfranchised. But in Pennsylvania, you're talking about those absentee ballots, and my thought process is the benefit, there's a long-term benefit of these lawsuits that are being put into place by the Trump campaign. And I want your thoughts on this. And that long-term benefit is no matter what happens in the election, no matter if you have a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency, hopefully there will be enough information that comes to light about casting ballots by mail that people will realize, you know what? I remember that election back in 2020 where they had all those thousands and thousands of ballots that were thrown out because people didn't sign them, or the signatures didn't match, or they didn't have it postmarked. And so therefore, you know what? I'm going to go vote in person.
Well, yeah. And
we can only hope, right?
We can only hope. I will tell you, I'm not a big person for creating federal rules that oversees states, because
likewise, by the way.
So I say this with some hesitation, but it is clear in some states, Nevada amongst them, they just mailed ballots to their entire voter registration list, live ballots. And hundreds of thousands of people didn't live at the addresses that were listed. You had hundreds of thousands of ballots that were floating around that didn't have a name on them because it was a secret ballot, that anybody could have voted.
The ballots didn't have a name on them?
No, because you can't have a name on a ballot. Now, the envelopes had coding.
Okay.
So they knew, oh, this one got returned, but they don't know how the person voted. So when you find 100,000 people voted who were not eligible, votes came back from places that they were not eligible to have received. They were no longer a registered voter at that address. When you have that happen, what you have is, there actually is a really, really hard way to try to figure it out. But because we have a secret ballot, once the ballot's separated from the envelope, there is no way to know who who voted for what.
Which is what they were vigorously doing in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Exactly right.
They were spending all of their time separating the envelopes as fast as they possibly could.
Because they knew once injected into the system, it is virtually impossible to be able to identify out of hundreds of thousands of votes, millions of votes, a single 10 ballots.
Has there
in the haystack stuff.
Has there ever been a time, since Pennsylvania seems to be ground zero of what we believe to be massive fraud or suspect to be massive fraud, has there ever been a time in American history when there was a redo of a state in a presidential election?
There has been a time when there was a redo of a congressional race. That was 2 years ago.
Okay.
A federal congressional race in North Carolina.
North Carolina.
A Republican won. But it was determined that they had used something called ballot harvesting, which, by the way, is legal in California, not illegal anywhere else.
So it's not legal in Pennsylvania.
So it's not
or
legal
Michigan.
in Pennsylvania and Michigan, but the truth is it's used all the time with mail-in ballots.
But because that's what you do.
That's what you do. And so consequently, while it's not legal, when the Democrats use it all the time, in North Carolina, a Republican used it. And so Nancy Pelosi got all upset, and, oh my gosh, this can't happen, even though in her state ballot harvesting is legal. She got up, jumped up and down, and the North Carolina government said, oh, we got to redo this election. Democrat governor said we have to redo this election. And so they overturned the election because of what was voter fraud. And by the way, the amount of voter fraud did not exceed the margin of victory, just to be clear. But overturned the election, they redid the election. So, and that district went without a representative for a good 6 to 9 months because of that.
So but you can't really do that with a presidency.
Here's the challenge. It's going to be really interesting. I'll give you an instance where they darn well better, and that is the Supreme Court ordered Pennsylvania to segregate the late arriving ballots.
Judge Alito wrote the order to separate
the late arriving ballots.
Do you think they did it?
I think there's a limited probability that actually occurred.
I seriously doubt they even tried.
So if it turns out that they did not segregate those ballots, okay, and the Secretary of State says they did, but if it's proven that they did not segregate those ballots in direct violation of a Supreme Court order, and you have ballots more than the margin of victory that were inserted into the system illegally against the Supreme Court order, the Supreme Court has to order that the Pennsylvania election is done over. Because here's the thing. If you could ignore a direct order from the Supreme Court, then no order from the Supreme Court has any validity. If the whole point of the Supreme Court is they set the rules and we all have to follow them. If you sit there and you say a direct order, no ambiguity, you have to do this and you don't do that, then you've violated the essence of
how do you
the
do
Supreme
a redo in Pennsylvania only?
I'll tell you how you do it.
How? Yeah, in a timely manner.
Well, I'll tell you how you do it.
I mean,
you say next Tuesday we're all voting. No mail-in ballots. You show up. Okay, you're a registered voter. You come in with your ID. Mm-hmm. We're going to have all the polling places open, not just some, and we are going to have actual federal people observing the election and saying, we're going to observe the count.
So maybe they would actually do like 5 days of voting.
No, you do one.
Really, just one?
We've done elections with one day all the time.
Well, you're going to hear COVID. It's COVID. You can't do it. Yeah, it's COVID.
But they can riot.
We need 5 days.
Well, they don't need 5 days. The point is the Supreme Court.
I would be fine giving them a week as long as there were people watching.
We don't have time. That we don't have time for, because it probably takes 2 weeks to actually put it together.
No doubt.
So you sit there and you say, but they already have the polling places. They already have the polling workers. They already have, all of the systems are in place. They could print the ballots. That doesn't take that long. They distribute the ballots. You've got your voting machines and everything like that. You go in. You sit there in any of the voting machines that are glitchy. You test them in advance. You allow no more software updates, as happened in some states where they got software updates the night before the election, so there's no way to test the software except for live an election. That actually happened also.
Gosh.
So there's they downloaded updates. So guess what? So that you create a system where everybody votes. Anybody who wants to vote comes and votes, who's eligible, who's a registered voter. They come and they vote. And their votes get tallied on the day, and they don't stop. They keep counting until they're done. And you come up with an answer. And you don't mess around. It's 2 weeks. It gives you, campaigns can go and they can, bust tail for 2 weeks to try to make sure that people vote, which is perfectly legit. But, they do parliamentary elections in Great Britain about 2.5 months, okay, from scratch. So so I suspect that 2 weeks, 3 weeks after we just went through a national election, the mechanics should be there to be able in place to do it.
Because they're still probably putting the machines away.
Now that's an extreme. I'm sure they're putting them away in a lot of places, the places that will never be found. But the point is, you can do it, and the severity of directly disobeying an order of the Supreme Court goes to the heart of the Supreme Court's ability to set the law of the land. Because if states can just say, I'm not following that.
Well, in this case, they're the arbiter. I mean, they were really kind of drawn into this conflict in Pennsylvania because of the fact that the Democrats decided there would be endless voting.
And they basically tried to split the baby. They said, we're going to allow you to continue to collect votes because the governor said that, and there's a lot of confusion. So we're allowed to continue to collect it, but if we're going to take a look at it afterwards, if it matters. We're going to take a look at it afterwards to determine whether or not those votes should be counted. And in order to do that, you have to segregate the votes.
Incredible.
It was very simple, and it's different than an order where where there could be kind of wiggle room. This is, defining. If you tell your kid, go to your room, and you're not allowed to have dessert, and your kid's sitting in the living room eating dessert, it's pretty clear your kid didn't follow your rules. And and you have a choice to make. Are you going to punish your kid? Or are you going to say, oh, well, it's okay, you've already eaten dessert, so it's okay? Well, no, you have to punish your kid under those circumstances.
Absolutely.
And given that, that's what Pennsylvania, if they did not segregate those ballots, that's what they did. That's the equivalency in real life.
So let me ask you something. You brought up in Nevada specifically how there were so many more votes cast. So many people have, starting from the beginning, obviously there's COVID. Nevada, particularly Las Vegas, relies heavily on casino gambling and workers who work at the hotels and the restaurants and so forth and the casinos. We know that. Well, they've been closed. Or they've been open just barely, at 50% capacity. So clearly, many of those individuals who work in those places have left. And so you were kind of intimating that, gee, we have all these extra voters. And today, there's a report that in 353 U.S. counties in the United States, 1.8 million more voters registered than eligible citizens. How's that possible? We saw it in Nevada. How can that be resolved in the future?
Well, first of all, it's possible because postcard registration allows you to register your cat if you want to. Okay, so so essentially there's absolutely little verification in terms of postcard registration.
Okay,
and so there's no security there. There are many states where, in California in particular, where people who are not eligible to vote are encouraged to register and to vote. And it is it gets a little confusing because sometimes they'll allow them to vote into people who are ineligible to vote on national elections or even state elections. They'll allow them to vote in local elections. And as a result, there is confusion amongst people about whether they're eligible to vote or not, and so that happens. It's the people who are doing it know it's illegal. The people who are promoting it know it's illegal. But the fact is, our voter registration system, can I tell you what one of the biggest mistakes the Trump administration made? It's a little divergence, but it's on point. They set up an election integrity commission at the very beginning of the administration. Okay, it had they were supposed to just look into trying to make sure there was election integrity. Very strange idea. Some friends of mine actually were on the election integrity commission. they went off and they asked the states to provide their voter rolls. The state said,
No.
no,
I
you
remember
can't.
that.
You cannot look at our voter rolls because of federalism, because we control our voter rolls, not you. And the president gave in on that, and he should not have, because you know what you could do, and Mark, you know this. You buy your voter lists, okay? You buy them. They don't give them to you.
They're available.
They're available.
Yes.
You buy them, and for about $50,000, they could have bought all the voter lists from Election Day 2016 from every state and gotten those voter lists. At which point they could have taken them and run them against Social Security rolls. They could have run them against the DACA rolls. They could have run them against any number of different things to determine if somebody was actually an eligible voter. They could have run them against national exchange of address forms from the post office and discovered how many people were not eligible because they weren't living at the address where they were registered. They could have run them nationally and see how many people were registered in Florida and Virginia.
And that would have had a profound impact, obviously, on having voting rolls that were accurate.
Voting rolls that are accurate, because ultimately, the security of the system is only as good as the voting rolls. Mm-hmm. And if the voting rolls aren't accurate, then everything else fails. And when you do a mail-in ballot, this is where we come back to, when you do a mail-in ballot, you're depending on the voting rolls being accurate. And in Pennsylvania's voting rolls were actually pretty accurate because they recently cleaned them. But in a lot of states, they don't clean the voting rolls for 10, 12 years. So you've got hundreds of thousands of people who don't live where they're supposed to live. And what that means is somebody at that address can request a ballot for themselves, but also for the person who used to live there. Because the voter rolls say they get, and the computer spits it out and sends it to them. And then that person can sit there and vote that. Now, they may seem benign, just one or two bits and pieces, but let's say you're registered at a nursing home. Okay? There's turnover at a nursing home.
Absolutely.
And that turnover is unfortunate.
Especially in New York.
In New York, yes. But that turnover is unfortunate, but it's real. So if you have people vote, it's very possible that you would have a far greater number of people registered in a nursing home than actually are living in the nursing home.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
And oh, by the way, many of the nursing homes are managed or run by a union.
Absolutely.
Which has a political interest. So you'd mail out ballots to 300 people in a 200-person nursing home, and you get those. And,
you have a lot of good ideas.
And somebody can, well, I've watched this for a long time.
So look, let me ask you something.
Bottom line is there's a lot of ways to cheat. We need the voter rolls cleaned up.
Absolutely. No, it's point well taken. So now we're going to move on to the down ballot races.
Sure.
So get this, podcast listeners. Down ballot races, AOC says Democrats didn't run on socialism. So once again, podcast listeners, listen to this. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, said the Democrats didn't run on socialism. They didn't, according to her. So she was interviewed by CNN's Jake Tapper, and she actually had the gall to say this. We have two clips on this, and we're going to discuss that with Rick Manning. And here's the first clip.
If you look at some of these, some of the arguments that are being advanced, that defund the police hurt, or that arguments about socialism hurt, not a single member of Congress that I'm aware of campaigned on socialism or defunding the police in this general election. And these were largely slogans, or they were demands from activist groups that we saw in the largest uprising in American history around police brutality.
Can you believe that? AOC says not a single member in the Democrat Party campaigned on socialism or to defund the police. She's part of the squad. That's all they talk about.
Well, but you have to listen to the clip very closely. She says in the general election. Okay? In the general election.
She qualified it.
She qualified it. And why didn't they? Because it doesn't poll well. So the objective was to not tell the American people what they stood for, and instead not talk about any issues whatsoever and have the whole issue be Orange Man bad.
Exactly.
That's what they ran on, Orange Man bad.
The whole election. So let me ask you something. Is there a difference between progressivism, which is what she calls herself in the squad, and socialism? See, I don't think there's a difference anymore.
I think socialism is more benign.
Meaning what? Explain.
Well, AOC talks about the people on the streets and, and movements and the like, and largest uprising. Well, you know what? There's a model that's being followed. If you go to Northern Ireland, the battles in Northern Ireland, what they call there the Troubles, you had the political arm of the Irish Republican Army, and then you had the military arm. And the political arm would go around and put a nice face on we need to have whatever they're saying they need to have, while the political arm, the IRA, was blowing up people. Okay, and that's the exact model that's being used here.
Explain.
There's the Democratic Socialists, who are AOC, who are the political model. They're standing up and they're putting a nice face on ideas, and pushing those ideas and trying to popularize and mainstream those ideas. But if you don't succumb to those ideas, they'll riot in front of the White House. They'll riot in front of the Supreme Court. They'll burn down your city.
They'll burn down your business.
And so they'll burn down your business. And
they'll
so
harass you while you're sitting outside of a cafe.
They'll do cancel culture, and they will sit there and say to a law firm, Jones Day, which is representing President Trump in some of these legal cases. They will go and say, "Hey, if you don't like the fact Jones Day has the president as a client, you should call them up and tell them you're not going to give them your business." And effectively, essentially, and oh, by the way, who says that? Joe Lockhart, the former press secretary for, I think it was Clinton. So it's legitimized. The cancel culture is legitimized. Now, people can do business with whoever they want to do business with, and I can't tell people to do business with Jones Day or not. What I can say is when the political operation is attempting to intimidate a law firm away from representing the President of the United States in legal challenges to determine the validity of the election, that's intimidation. And that's what the military wing, which is Antifa, of the Democrat Socialist Party does.
Interesting. So she also, by the way, that was brilliant. AOC also says that the reason, and she doesn't say socialism, she says the reason progressivism hasn't really caught on is because the Democrat Party hasn't really bought in yet internally in the Democrat Party. They haven't really bought into it. They haven't fully accepted it. That's the second clip, and here's that clip.
So we can help. It's not saying that every member has to campaign as a progressive in a traditional progressive way, but it's to say that we have assets to offer the party that the party has not yet, fully leaned into or exploited.
Yes, so the party has not fully leaned into progressivism. They haven't fully, accepted. That's what she means by leaned into, obviously. But had they done so, they would have been much more successful in the congressional elections instead of losing so many seats in this past election in that lower house to the Republicans.
Right. They lost. I predicted it'll end up being 8 to 10 seats.
Which is a lot.
Which is a lot.
So does she get it? I mean, does she? I think that she totally knows what she's saying. She wants a socialist party.
Here's what she gets. Elliot Engel, who was as liberal as you get, loses to a Democrat socialist, in a primary in New York. Carolyn Maloney, who's extraordinarily liberal, barely hangs on by the skin of her teeth against the Democrat socialist. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ran against the most liberal person in the House of Representatives and beat him because he wasn't liberal enough. Okay? So, when you get down to it, this is really pretty simple. And it's an there is a conversion in the Democratic Party. It is a move. They're basically taking off the shields of not being socialists, and they are embracing it. In fact, they're just not embracing as much as she would like for them to. And I think she expressed this. Well, here's what she said about Joe Biden. She said, "Any party that has Joe Biden and me in it is not a party at all, because we have nothing in common."
Unbelievable.
So that was her when she was campaigning for socialist Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic nominee.
And my takeaway from those two clips of AOC as an elected official, which I rarely, say on this podcast, is what I have noticed in the Democrat Party with colleagues that I have on the other side is just like what AOC said. Well, we should give room to members in the Democrat Party to run, not necessarily as progressives or socialists, so at least we can get them elected. And in other words, what she's saying is something that I have seen personally, which is Democrats who, once they get elected from districts that are kind of swing districts, they come into office and you realize, you know what, they're really not moderates, or they're not even a conservative Democrat. They're really progressives. They're, in some cases, outright socialists because of their voting record, but they hide who they are, which is what she was saying.
Exactly.
Hide who you are.
This is not, by the way, this is not new. It is, we can deal with it now because we have more information, more access to information. It's just, everybody knows that this happens. People come back here, nobody knows what they're doing. Back home, people vote. What do people do after they vote? They go back to work. They say, this is over, I'm doing my thing, I'm going working. I'm not looking at voting records. I'm not looking, if it comes up and they're concerned about gun control, they might look at what they do on gun control or something like that. But by and large, you come up here and you make 1,000 votes, and a lot of times the one that's printed isn't the important one.
No, it's not.
It's a matter of, it's rarely the important one. That's a foregone conclusion. It's the stuff that was put in the interim where you voted for against amendments, you voted for a rule, all those things that you and I understand, but most people, they don't need to understand that. That's inside baseball.
It is.
But those are the votes that matter. And so somebody can say, I voted against raising your taxes by 20%, when they voted for everything along the way that allowed that vote to go to the floor.
Precisely.
And then they voted against it, and they said, and they run on, I voted against it. I stood up to leadership.
I voted against it before I voted for it, or for it before I voted against it.
And because the
so
system,
true.
And that's and once again, it's up to competing political parties to make those cases. It's why one-party states are on either side are harmed, because you don't have people with enough resources to tell the truth about what's really going on, so voters have a real decision.
Amen to that. And that's AOC says Dems didn't run on socialism. So, Rick Manning, final thoughts on this election before we close out.
This election was probably, I think when we get done, Donald Trump will be the winner. But he's the winner either way, because the Republicans should not have held control of the Senate. And assuming they win the 2 seats in Georgia, they will hold control of the Senate. The Republicans had no business picking up seats in the House. It's unprecedented for a president to win an election and then not pick up seats in the House. In fact, it's also unprecedented for a president coming in and not winning control of the Senate in his first term. So Joe Biden, rather than a mandate, Joe Biden will be dealing at best with a divided legislature that won't be able to get anything controversial done. That's good. If Joe Biden is the president, he's going to have to basically operate using his pen and his phone to do things around the margins.
Yep, executive order stuff.
And so we will see that. We'll see fights over treaties. We'll see fights over those kinds of things. But Joe Biden will not have the capacity to be a consequential president because the American people tied up the legislature in such a way that nothing's going to happen legislatively. And by the way, the same thing will be true when Donald Trump is president second term. And I will tell you, the only thing that's going to get done in a massive way will be infrastructure, because both sides will be able to agree that they want to spend money on their own districts.
And that's it for Mark of the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark of the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher, and special thanks to Rick Manning of Americans for Limited Government, and they also produce thedailytorch.com, right?
Correct.
And of course, our producer, Adam Couture, our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.